One man lived in complete isolation for over 2 decades, after it's believed that his tribe was wiped out due to illegal farmers and loggers who would end up encroaching on their land. He became known as Tanaru, or as the Man of the Hole, named after the deep pits he dug inside of every hut he constructed. This is a true story of one of the last isolated individuals in the Amazon rainforest and the mystery surrounding his life. And while we now have footage of the Man of the Hole, that wasn't always the case. The first evidence of the man's existence was documented in 1996 by FUNAI, a Brazilian agency led to protect indigenous populations. They were monitoring land in the Tanaru Indigenous Territory, which is a heavily deforested area, and it's in part due to the illegal farmers and loggers who have come into the area. The Brazilian government determined that there were likely still people living in that region, but they didn't see Tanaru, as they would only come across abandoned settlements. First, they came across a couple of abandoned huts with some footprints and some small crops like corn and manioc. But then they started to notice something pretty strange. Every hut had this deep rectangular hole right in the middle of the floor, and it became clear someone was living there, but they didn't know who it was. And over time, they would come across dozens of these huts with the exact same hole dug in the middle. And that's how he got his nickname, the Man of the Hole. And to this day, nobody really knows what the holes were for. Some people say that maybe they were hiding places or for hunting traps, and others think it could have been more spiritual, or some kind of ritual or mourning tradition for his lost people. And they believed he was the last survivor of an uncontacted tribe that they believe had been murdered in the 90s by ranchers and illegal loggers. And to this day, no name for his group is known, and no language has ever been recorded. As after the farmers and loggers took out his tribe, he would live the next 26 years completely alone. And to those who found him in the forest, he would let them know immediately that he wanted the isolation to remain permanent. As prior to him being found, it was highly debated whether indigenous groups were still living in the region. It was known by FUNAI that the government was borderline working against them, as they would turn a blind eye to the destruction of the forest simply for profit. But Vincent Corelli would prove this, as in 1996, during an attempt to document Tanaru, he would also be accompanied by 2 of the indigenous specialists from FUNAI as well, along with several recently contacted individuals from the Kanoe tribe, with the Kanoe performing traditional rituals and the FUNAI officials offering practical items such as machetes and tools to help aid him come out of the hut. And he seems absolutely terrified. As you can see, he's sticking out one of his spears to show people that he does not want to be encroached upon. And even with the other indigenous people trying to make calls to him, he still doesn't want to respond. And then just for a moment, you can see him peek through and borderline make eye contact with the camera. You can only imagine how terrified he would have been in this moment. But this most likely brought him back to the time that his tribe was slaughtered by the loggers and the ranchers. And the researchers got awfully close to his hut, only about 6 to 10 feet away from the entrance. And Corelli, aiming to capture visual evidence of Tanaru's existence, positioned himself nearby with a camera. But due to the perceived hostile interaction, Tanaru would then fire an arrow at Corelli's direction. Luckily, the arrow would miss, and he later described the experience as a chaotic and ethically complex situation, as he acknowledged that there was a great need to document him. But at the same time, the risks of intruding upon the life of an individual who had repeatedly chosen isolation would be dangerous. And after capturing the footage that's playing right now, it would be submitted to a federal justice court. And in 1997, a judge issued an order to restrict access to the land, halting deforestation in the Tanaru area. This legal action marked the initial step towards formally recognizing the territory as indigenous land. And when you take a look at Google Earth, you can see just how much of the Amazon rainforest has changed over the last 10 years alone. Then when you go back and find other maps, you really get an idea of just how much land is being taken, and not only in the area of Rondonia, but as a whole throughout the Amazon rainforest. And this isn't the only case of an indigenous person being the last member of their tribe. Similarly to Tanaru and the other Amazonian tribes, Ishi would find himself being the last remaining member of his tribe in Northern California, and they were known as the Yahi tribe. He would live in hiding after massacres were carried out in the mid to late 1800s by settlers and ranchers. He would voluntarily be taken in by anthropologists at the University of California, Berkeley, who studied his language, tools, and his way of life prior to coming into civilization, all the while employing him as a janitor at the university's museum. But unfortunately, he would die of tuberculosis in 1916, just 5 years after entering into civilization. This is a common outcome that we've seen with other indigenous populations, as those who come in contact with those who live in the quote-unquote civilized world often end up dying of diseases that their bodies simply didn't have any antibodies built up for. Social media influencer and rainforest expert Paul Rosalie would end up creating an activist group known as Jungle Keepers, and they're actively searching and implementing ways that they can stop the deforestation of the ancient Amazon. The Amazon rainforest has lost over 160 million acres of forestry, which represents roughly 20% of its original size, once covering approximately 1.5 to 1.7 billion acres across South America, has been increasingly cleared since the mid-20th century, following the construction of major infrastructure like Brazil's Trans-Amazonian Highway. And throughout the 1970s and 80s, logging and cattle ranchers began to displace dense jungle with pasture land. Then, by the 1990s and early 2000s, large-scale soy farming would enter into the forest. But then in 2007, the Brazilian government would designate almost 20,000 acres of land for the indigenous territory, and it was reserved solely for the protection of the man of the whole. And this would guarantee safety for Tanaru, but only for so long, as over the years, he would be the target of multiple threats. As in 2009, a group of armed ranchers attacked Funai staff guarding the reserve, and they attempted to locate him to get him off of the area. But this would only increase protections for him, and the officials from Funai would discover that the protection post had been vandalized, and many shotgun shells would be found scattered throughout the nearby forest. And one of the researchers would write, "This is a grave situation. The indigenous man's life is being threatened by the actions and interest of the local ranchers." And we have to remember that in the eyes of the loggers and the farmers, this one single man is stopping them from millions of dollars in financial gain. For the man of the whole, surviving in the Amazon is something he'd be completely used to. But for us, surviving in the Amazon is completely unforgiving, even for those who are deeply familiar with its terrain. And over time, everything begins to rot. Food spoils quickly, wood deteriorates, and even the most simple tasks like making a fire become extremely difficult. There's a running joke that you shouldn't tell someone to start a fire in the Amazon rainforest because whatever morale they had left would quickly go away. You have to remember that the Amazon rainforest has tons of rivers and many rolling hills that go throughout its landscape. This makes it extremely difficult to cross over anything, and why it's even more impressive that Tanaru was able to live for as long as he did. Because living in a tribe would make sense. You can disperse the work out for many people, but when it's one person, all of it falls on you. Clean drinking water is basically a suggestion, and food is also extremely difficult to come by. And he would frequently relocate to avoid detection or because of the resources were being depleted in his area. We don't know how long he stayed in each of his huts, but it's believed that he had over 50 of them, meaning every 6 months to a year or less, he would start completely from scratch. So at this point, it's been documented that he's only been seen about one time in the past 50 years. But then in 2018, the only other known piece of footage from the man of the hole would be recorded by a field team of researchers. They would observe Tanaru chopping away at a tree with his homemade axe, completely oblivious to those who were recording him, and alongside the millions of people who would watch him on something unbeknownst to him, something called the internet. This gives incredible insight into the life of those who live outside of civilization, as watching something as simple as watching a man cut down a tree gives you firsthand proof of his existence and into his way of life. It's also interesting to think of how they were able to sneak up on him. This is a guy who's been living in the forest his entire life, but at the same time, he was completely preoccupied by knocking down a tree and he wasn't even facing their direction. But it also would have been interesting to see how Tanaru would have reacted if he did see the researchers. But he most likely would have been shocked and become immediately defensive. And because of the prior stories of the loggers and farmers who were going after to kill him, we're also lucky that it was with the researchers who were able to find him in the woods and not those who could have intended harm. And he was in his 50s by then, but was still in incredible shape. And like I said before, he had to forage for everything: food, water, and shelter. 3 of the most difficult things to obtain in any civilization. So when you think about it, all of this physical labor over and over and over again, and then the mental fatigue of having to do it all yourself and not having anyone there with you must take a toll. But he most likely found the isolated lifestyle would work best for him, because there's a reason why his story is about isolation. He had every opportunity to leave and search for different tribes or communities, but he chose to stay. And this would all come to an end, because in August of 2022, one of Funai's monitoring teams found him in his hammock, deceased and covered in macaw feathers. Tanaru most likely knew that the end was coming and decided to cover himself in the feathers, which was likely part of his original tribe's ritual, or it was something he decided to make up himself. Tanaru would finally be laid to rest, and researchers believe that he would be in his 60s at the time of his death. There are other tribes in the Amazon rainforest who are in very similar situations to what Tanaru was in. Many of them are being faced with extermination by the farmers and loggers who have come into the area, as they've aimed to take their land for nothing but corporate greed. I highly recommend you guys to check out Paul Rosalie or any of these other organizations that aim to keep the Amazon rainforest and its people wild and remote. So as always, I appreciate you guys for watching my videos, and if you have suggestions, leave them in the comments because I read them all, and I'll be back for another video soon. See you guys.